The years had transformed Nyala into a woman of wisdom, strength, and grace. Gone was the timid girl who once bent under the weight of endless burdens. In Bamuto, she had flourished like a tree, finally given the water and sunlight it needed to grow. With education, she sharpened her mind, learning the ways of leadership, trade, and justice. Her heart, though once hardened by pain, softened with the knowledge that true power came not from cruelty, but from kindness. She had become a respected advisor to Prince Jabari, her voice carrying weight in matters of the kingdom. People listened when she spoke. They sought her guidance, for she had the rare gift of seeing the truth hidden beneath deceit. But while Nyala thrived, the village of Zambora withered. The once prosperous land had been swallowed by famine. Crops failed, rivers dried, and hunger gnawed at the people's bones. The same hands that had once pointed at Nyala in mockery now trembled with desperation. And at the center of their suffering was Muani. Muani, once feared and respected, now knew the bitter taste of struggle. The woman who once ruled over Nyala had lost everything. Her wealth had vanished, her home was falling apart, and the villagers who once bowed to her now turned away. Food was scarce, and her once proud face had grown sunken with hunger. Every step she took was a reminder of the power she had lost. She had once forced Nyala to carry unbearable burden, but now she carried the weight of her own downfall. In her suffering, Muani's pride remained unbroken. She refused to believe this was her fate. She clung to the hope that things would change, that she would rise again. But deep down, fear whispered in her ears. Fear that perhaps this was Karma's hand, that the girl she had once tormented had become greater than she ever could. And in the dead of night, when the hunger was too loud to ignore, Muani would sit in the darkness, whispering Nyala's name, wondering if the girl she had once broken would ever return. The sun hung low over Zambora, casting long shadows over the dry, cracked earth. The air was thick with the scent of desperation. Hunger had made the villagers weak, their once lively spirits now reduced to hollow eyes and frail bodies. The village that had once been filled with laughter and bustling trade now stood in silence, only broken by the whispers of those too proud to beg, but too desperate to stay silent. The elders, who had once turned a blind eye to Muani's cruelty, now sat in a circle, their faces etched with concern. They had ruled for decades, but never had they seen suffering like this. The crops had failed, the river had dried, and disease crept into the homes of even the strongest men. It was clear Zambora was falling apart, and they knew, deep in their hearts, that there was only one person who could save them. With reluctant hearts, they sent a messenger to Bamuto, carrying a plea for help. The very name they had once scorned was now the only hope they had. "Find Nyala," they told the messenger. "Tell her the village needs her. Tell her that the very land she once suffered on is now crumbling. And tell her Muani seeks forgiveness." Muani, once the queen of Zambora, was now nothing more than a shadow of her former self. The weight of her past sins had pressed her into the dirt, leaving her frail and broken. Her fine clothes had turned to rags. Her hands once adorned with gold were now rough and calloused. The same village that once feared her now pitied her, and she hated it. But fate had a cruel sense of irony. The same woman who had forced Nyala to bow before her was now the one who had to beg. When the elders told her that Nyala might return, Muani's pride fought against her desperation. But hunger had no patience for pride. So with tears that burned her soul, she whispered the words she had never imagined saying. "If Nyala comes, I will kneel before her. I will ask for her mercy." Fena, who had once walked with her chin high and her heart filled with arrogance, was no better. Her beauty, once her greatest weapon, had faded under the weight of hardship. She had never known suffering before. Her mother had always shielded her from it. But now, there was no protection. The villagers had turned against them. No one would trade with them. No one would offer them food. And worst of all, the men who once chased after her now passed her by without a second glance. She sat beside her mother, their hands empty, their stomachs hollow, their spirits broken. For the first time, Fena understood what Nyala had felt all those years ago: the humiliation, the helplessness, the pain. And with that realization came a terrible truth. She had been wrong. She had been cruel. And now she was paying the price. As the messenger rode toward Bamuto, The village of Zambora held its breath. Would Nyala return? Would she forgive? Or had they pushed her too far, leaving her heart too scarred to look back? Only time would tell. The journey back to Zambora was not one of sorrow, but of strength. Nyala sat tall on a majestic black stallion, her posture regal, her presence commanding. The once forgotten girl, the one who had carried burdens like a beast of labor, was now returning in a way no one could have ever imagined. She was no longer a servant, no longer the girl who had been spat upon and mistreated. She was powerful now, respected, and her name carried weight far beyond Zambora. Behind her, a procession followed. Royal guards dressed in shining armor rode alongside her, their spears reflecting the golden light of the sun. Behind them, carts filled with sacks of grain, baskets of fruit, and jugs of clean water trailed the convoy. Gifts for the starving villagers. But the greatest gift Nyala carried was not the wealth she brought with her. It was the lesson of mercy, a lesson she had learned through hardship and pain. As she neared the village, whispers spread like wildfire. People peeked out from their huts, their tired faces etched with disbelief. Children, barefoot and hungry, ran ahead to get a closer look at the magnificent sight approaching their home. The elders, who had once dismissed Nyala as a mere orphan, stood frozen, their pride swallowing their tongues. This was not the weak, helpless girl they had cast aside. This was a queen in her own right. Muani, sitting in the dirt outside her crumbling hut, felt her breath catch in her throat. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw Nyala, adorned in the richest of fabric, her skin glowing, her head held high. The woman who had once ruled over Nyala's suffering now had nothing but rags covering her frail body. She wanted to hide, to disappear into the ground beneath her, but there was nowhere to run. She had no power left. Fena, standing beside her mother, could barely breathe. The girl she had mocked, the girl she had tormented, was now surrounded by warriors. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer someone they could hurt. She was untouchable. Fena had spent years believing that beauty was the most powerful weapon a woman could possess. But looking at Nyala now, she realized how wrong she had been. True power was not in looks or cruelty. It was in resilience. The royal convoy stopped in the center of the village. Nyala dismounted gracefully, her golden sandals pressing against the dusty ground. The silence was suffocating. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. Then, with a voice that was calm but firm, Nyala addressed the people. I have returned, not as the girl you once knew, but as someone who chooses kindness over vengeance. I do not come to punish, nor to seek revenge. I come to help, because no matter what has been done to me, I will not let Zambora suffer. Muani's lips trembled. The shame was unbearable. She had expected anger, expected to be cast away like she had once done to Nyala, but instead, she was met with grace. Fena lowered her gaze, unable to look Nyala in the eyes. She had spent years believing she was better than her. Now she felt smaller than a grain of sand. The villagers, overwhelmed with emotion, fell to their knees in gratitude. For the first time in years, hope had returned to Zambora, and it came in the form of the very girl they had once abandoned. The air in Zambora was thick with tension. The villagers, who had once turned a blind eye to Nyala's suffering, now stood together, their eyes burning with a thirst for justice. Word had spread like wildfire. Nyala had returned, not as a broken girl, but as a woman of power. Now, she sat before the village elders, the same ones who had ignored her cries for help, but this time, they were the ones looking to her for guidance. The gathering was the largest Zambora had seen in years. The elders sat in a semicircle, their faces lined with regret. The villagers surrounded them, whispering among themselves. They wanted Muani to pay. They wanted her to suffer for the way she had treated Nyala. Muani stood before them, her once proud posture now reduced to nothing. She was thin, frail, and weak. Her clothes were tattered, her feet bare and covered in dust. Her arrogance had long disappeared, replaced by fear. She could feel the weight of every angry stare piercing through her. She knew this day would come, but she had never imagined it would be Nyala sitting in a place of power, while she stood helpless before her. Beside her, Fena clutched her mother's arm, trembling. The once beautiful girl, who had spent her life looking down on Nyala, now kept her gaze to the ground. She could hear the villagers murmuring about her, how karma had finally found its way back to her family. One of the elders cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. Nyala, he began, his voice slow and careful. You have returned not only as our savior, but as proof that justice always prevails. The people of Zambora demand that Muani pay for what she has done. They want her cast out, punished for her cruelty. What is your command? A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. The villagers wanted revenge. They wanted Muani to suffer the way Nyala had suffered. Some suggested she be made to carry heavy loads until she collapsed. Others wanted her to be banished, to live the rest of her life in isolation. Muani's hands trembled. She could not bear to look at Nyala. She braced herself for the punishment that was to come. But Nyala did not speak right away. She watched the scene before her, seeing the same hunger for punishment in the eyes of the villagers that had once existed in Muani's own. She had dreamed of this moment before, but now that it was here, she felt something different. Vengeance was not what her heart craved. Finally, Nyala rose to her feet. The crowd fell silent. "I understand your anger," she said, her voice strong but calm. "I understand your thirst for justice. Muani treated me like an animal. She made me carry burdens that were too heavy for my body. She humiliated me, starved me, and showed me no mercy." She turned to face Muani, who flinched under her gaze. "And yet," Nyala continued, "if I do to her what she did to me, then how are we any different?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. The villagers exchanged confused glances. Was Nyala going to let Muani go unpunished? "I do not believe that true justice is found in revenge," Nyala said. "Muani must learn the pain she caused, but not through suffering. She must learn it through redemption." The elders watched in silence, their respect for Nyala growing. She had wisdom beyond her years, wisdom they had failed to see before. "I have decided on Muani's fate," Nyala declared. "She will not be cast out. She will not be made to suffer. Instead, she will spend the rest of her days serving the village, feeding the poor, and working the fields. She will learn what it means to truly carry the burdens of others, not as punishment, but as a lesson." Muani's knees buckled, tears welled in her eyes. She had expected the worst, but this was far more painful. She would be forced to look into the eyes of those she had wronged every single day. She would have to live with the shame, knowing that the girl she had once despised had chosen mercy over cruelty. The villagers, though surprised, slowly nodded in agreement. Nyala's decision was not one of weakness, but of strength. And as the sun set on Zambora that day, it was clear to all. Nyala was not just a woman of power, she was a woman of true justice. Muani and Fena stood before the gathered villagers, their once proud faces now heavy with fear and shame. The weight of their past cruelty loomed over them, and they knew there was no escaping judgment. Nyala, seated with the elders, did not speak immediately. She watched them, her eyes calm but piercing, holding the power they had once tried to crush. The silence stretched, thick with tension, as the villagers waited for her decision. Finally, Nyala rose to her feet. Her voice was steady, filled with a strength that had been forged through years of pain and perseverance. "You once made me carry burdens heavier than my own strength. You crushed my spirit and treated me worse than an animal. But today, I will not seek revenge. I will offer you a choice." Muani and Fena lifted their eyes, uncertain, yet desperate. The villagers leaned in, eager to hear what Nyala had planned. "You can choose exile," Nyala continued. "Leave this village forever, never to return, with nothing but the clothes on your back. Or," she paused, letting the weight of her words settle, "you can stay and redeem yourselves by serving the very people you once mistreated." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The villagers exchanged glances, some nodding in approval. Muani's face twisted with resistance. She had spent her life controlling others. Being at the mercy of the same villagers she had once ruled over was unbearable. Fena, trembling, fell to her knees. Tears streamed down her face, and her voice broke as she spoke. "I was blinded by my mother's greed and cruelty. I see it now, Nyala. I do not deserve mercy, but if you give me a chance, I will serve. I will do whatever it takes to make things right." Nyala studied Fena for a long moment. The arrogance was gone, replaced by genuine remorse. But Muani clenched her fists, her pride still clinging to her like a heavy chain. "You expect me to serve these people," she spat, her voice laced with defiance. "I was their leader. They obeyed me once. Because they feared you," an elder interrupted. "Not because they respected you." Nyala stepped forward, her voice softer now. "Muani, no one is forcing you, but if you stay, you will carry the same weight you once placed on me." She gestured, and two strong villagers stepped forward, carrying a massive sack filled with grain. They placed it before Muani. "You force me to carry heavy loads like a donkey, Now you will carry this to every home in the village, ensuring no one starves." A stunned silence filled the air. Muani's face paled. She had spent years breaking others, never thinking she would one day be broken herself. The weight of karma had finally come for her. The villagers erupted in cheers. Justice had been served, not with blood, not with cruelty, but with a punishment that fit the crime. Muani hesitated, but she knew there was no escape. With trembling hands, she lifted the sack onto her back. It was heavier than she expected, crushing her shoulders instantly. Her knees wobbled, but she refused to fall. Fena wiped her tears and stood. "I will serve willingly," she declared. "Let me carry the baskets of food to the elders." The villagers clapped in approval as she hurried to pick up the smaller baskets, placing them on her head with determination. Unlike her mother, she was ready to change. Nyala watched them go, her heart steady. This was not revenge. It was balance. It was justice. She turned back to the elders and the people of Zambora. "Let this be a lesson," she said. "Power built on cruelty will always crumble, but those who choose kindness and humility will always rise." And with that, Muani, once feared and powerful, walked through the village under the crushing weight of her own past sins, while Fena, with her head bowed, began her path to redemption. Muani had once walked through Zambora with her head held high, feared by many and respected by none. Now, she moved through the village hunched under the weight of the heavy sacks she was forced to carry. Sweat dripped from her brow as she stumbled, her body weakened by years of comfort and control. Every morning, she was given the same task: deliver food and supplies to the very people she once mistreated. And every day, her spirit broke a little more. The villagers no longer cowered before her. Instead, they watched in silence, some shaking their heads, others muttering about karma. She could hear their whispers as she struggled down the dirt path. "She used to make Nyala suffer like this," an old woman murmured. "Now she knows how it feels." Muani bit down on her lip, rage bubbling inside her. She wanted to scream at them, remind them who she was, remind them that she had once ruled over them. But what power did she have now? She was nothing more than a servant, bound by the very chains she had once placed on Nyala. At night she collapsed onto her mat, her body aching, her pride shattered. For the first time in her life, she felt powerless. But instead of reflecting on her mistakes, her heart clung to bitterness. She despised Nyala for returning as a queen. She despised the villagers for celebrating her downfall. She despised herself for being weak. Fena, on the other hand, had chosen a different path. While Muani's heart remained hard, Fena had surrendered to the lessons life was teaching her. She woke up each morning with a new sense of purpose, carrying baskets of food, cleaning the elders' homes, helping the sick. She no longer moved with arrogance, but with quiet determination. One evening, as Nyala walked through the village, she saw Fena kneeling beside a frail old man, feeding him with her own hands. His weak fingers trembled as he reached for the food, tears in his eyes. "Bless you, child," he whispered. Nyala watched from the shadows, her heart warming. Fena had been given a chance to redeem herself, and she was proving that she had truly changed. But Nyala could see that she still carried resentment in her heart. Days passed, and Muani grew weaker. Her once powerful body, accustomed to comfort and control, now struggled to even stand. Every step she took was heavier than the last, and each burden she carried felt like a punishment she refused to accept. One evening, as she tried to lift a sack of grain, her arms gave out and she collapsed onto the ground. Villagers stopped and stared. Some whispered, some looked away. Then, something unexpected happened. Fena, who had just finished cleaning the village well, ran toward her mother. Without hesitation, she knelt beside her, lifting the sack from her broken shoulders. "Let me help," she said softly. Muani looked up, her pride battling against the kindness in her daughter's eyes. For years, she had taught Fena to be ruthless, to think only of herself. And yet, here she was, offering help to the very woman who had led her down the wrong path. Nyala watched from a distance. The moment was a test to see if Muani had finally learned. Would she accept kindness? Would she finally let go of her pride? Muani's lips trembled, her eyes filling with something unfamiliar. But instead of gratitude, she pushed Fena's hands away and struggled to her feet on her own. She wouldn't change. She couldn't. Nyala sighed. Some hearts could be healed, but others remained hardened. The test was over, and soon, Muani would face her final lesson. The sky above Zambora rumbled with fury as dark clouds swallowed the moon. The wind howled through the village, shaking the trees and rattling the old, worn-out huts. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking the ground, turning the dirt roads into thick mud. It was the kind of storm that made people stay indoors, whispering prayers that their homes would not be swept away. But outside, in the middle of the storm, Muani struggled beneath the weight of a massive sack filled with grain. Her once strong hands trembled, her knees buckling with every step she took. The cold rain beat against her face, mixing with the sweat and tears she refused to acknowledge. Her body was failing her, and for the first time in her life, she had no power to stop it. With one final step, her strength gave out. The sack slipped from her grip, crashing onto the ground and splattering grain into the mud. Her legs crumbled beneath her, and she collapsed, her body sinking into the wet earth. Pain shot through her back, her arms, her legs. Every inch of her body ached. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the realization that struck her in that moment. She had once made Nyala carry loads heavier than this, under the scorching sun, without mercy, without care. She had ignored Nyala's cries, laughed at her struggles, treated her like nothing more than an animal. And now, here she was, helpless, broken, defeated. Tears, real and bitter, spilled from her eyes as she let out a strangled sob. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring thunder. "Why is this happening to me?" Lightning flashed, illuminating the village for a brief moment, and in that flash, she saw something that made her heart twist in agony. Fena. Her daughter stood a few feet away, drenched from the rain, staring at her mother with a mixture of sadness and understanding. Muani expected her to turn away. She wouldn't blame her if she did. She had raised Fena to be selfish, to think only of herself, to never lower herself for anyone. And yet, as another streak of lightning lit up the sky, Muani saw Fena stepping forward, rushing to her side. Without hesitation, Fena knelt in the mud, her hands reaching for her mother. "Mother, hold on," she said, her voice steady despite the storm. Muani flinched at the kindness in her daughter's voice. It was a voice she had never taught her to have, a voice filled with compassion, not cruelty. "I don't deserve your help," Muani choked out, her pride crumbling like the world around her. Fena ignored her words. "You're my mother," she said simply, "and I won't leave you here." With great effort, Fena lifted the sack of grain, placing it safely under a nearby shelter. Then, she turned back to her mother, wrapping her arms around her and helping her to her feet. Muani was weak, her body barely able to stand, but Fena held her up, supporting her weight as they made their way back home. The villagers, who had watched Muani's cruelty for years, stood in silent awe. They had expected Fena to abandon her mother, to leave her to suffer the way Muani had left others. But Fena had chosen a different path. As they reached the safety of a hut, Muani collapsed onto a mat, her breathing ragged, her heart heavy. She looked up at her daughter, truly seeing her for the first time. Fena had changed. She had become the kind of person Muani never was, the kind of person Muani had tried to prevent her from becoming. And now, as she lay there, broken and defeated, she realized that she had lost, not to Nyala, not to the village, but to karma, and karma had won. The morning after the storm, the village of Zambora gathered once again in the center, where the elders sat in their traditional robes, their faces grave with the weight of an important decision. The air was thick with anticipation, the villagers whispering among themselves, waiting to see what would happen next. Muani, weak and trembling, knelt before them, her once proud posture now broken. Her clothes, once fine and rich, were tattered and soaked with mud. The woman who had once commanded fear now looked like nothing more than a defeated soul. Nyala stood before her, tall and regal, her presence radiating power and grace. She had once knelt in this very spot, humiliated, beaten, forced to endure endless suffering at the hands of this woman. Now, the tables had turned, and the entire village awaited her decision. Would she show mercy, or would she let Muani taste the same cruelty she had once inflicted? One of the elders turned to Nyala, his voice deep and commanding. "Nyala, you have every right to seek justice. This woman wronged you, humiliated you, cast you aside as if you were nothing. What do you say? Should we punish her, or shall you decide her fate?" The crowd fell silent, all eyes locked on Nyala. Muani dared not look up. She knew she had no right to beg for mercy, no right to ask for anything after the way she had treated Nyala. Nyala took a deep breath, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. She had dreamed of this moment before, imagined what it would feel like to see Muani suffer as she once did. But now, standing here, she felt something unexpected: pity. She saw not the powerful, cruel woman who had once tormented her, but a broken soul, one who had lost everything. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I will not punish her," she declared. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and even the elders looked surprised. "I will not become what she was. I will not let hatred rule my heart." Muani's eyes widened, her lips trembling as she finally looked up. "But," Nyala continued, her expression turning serious, "she will not walk away without consequences. She will serve this village for the rest of her life. She will work for the people she once looked down upon, and she will know what it means to truly give." The villagers murmured among themselves, nodding in agreement. Muani's body shook as she tried to process the words. She had expected punishment, maybe even exile, but instead, Nyala had chosen to spare her. Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she felt something she had never truly experienced: gratitude. With great effort, she bowed low, her forehead touching the ground. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "Thank you, Nyala. Thank you for showing me mercy when I showed you none." Nyala looked down at her, her expression unreadable. "True change comes from actions, not words. Let's see if you truly mean it." Muani nodded, knowing this was her final chance to prove she could be better. She would no longer be the woman who ruled through fear. She would spend the rest of her life making up for the harm she had caused. As the villagers cheered for Nyala's wisdom and kindness, Muani remained on her knees, knowing that from this day forward, she would no longer live as a woman of power, but as a servant to those she had once wronged. And perhaps, in time, she could finally find redemption. The village of Zambora had not seen a celebration like this in years. The air was thick with the mouth-watering aroma of roasted meat and freshly baked bread. Colourful fabrics hung from trees, and villagers bustled about, their faces alight with joy. Tonight was not just a feast. It was a moment of history, a moment when change had been embraced, when kindness had won over cruelty, and when the once-forgotten girl had returned as a symbol of strength and wisdom. In the centre of it all, Nyala sat gracefully on an ornately carved wooden seat, not as a queen, but as a beloved daughter of the land. The people gathered around her, showering her with blessings, offering her gifts of fruits, handmade jewelry, and finely woven baskets. She accepted them with a humble smile, her heart full. This was the same village that had once turned its back on her, the same people who had whispered behind her back, yet here they were, celebrating her return, honouring her strength. Among the crowd, Fena stood, her eyes glistening with emotion. She had changed, and everyone could see it. The woman who had once basked in arrogance, who had laughed at Nyala's suffering, now stood by her side like a faithful sister. She had spent the past days proving herself, working tirelessly to help others, showing kindness where she had once shown cruelty. Now, she looked at Nyala with nothing but admiration. "You are everything I once wished I could be," Fena said softly, stepping closer. "Strong, kind, and wise. I never understood before, but I see it now. I see why the gods have favored you." Nyala turned to her, smiling gently. "The gods favor those who change for the better, Fena. You have taken the first steps." Fena's head bowed slightly, her heart swelling with gratitude. If someone had told her years ago that she would be standing here, standing beside the very woman she had once despised, she wouldn't have believed it. But now, she felt no shame in serving Nyala, no bitterness in calling her a friend. As the music began, drums echoed through the night, and the villagers broke into dance. Children ran around joyfully, elders clapped their hands, and laughter filled the air. It was a night of healing, a night of new beginnings. Even Muani, who had once ruled with cruelty, sat quietly among the people, watching it all unfold. Her punishment had been set to serve the village for the rest of her life, but instead of bitterness, she felt something strange stir in her heart. For the first time in her life, she felt content. She no longer carried the weight of arrogance and pride. She was learning, slowly but surely, what it meant to truly live among people rather than above them. At the far end of the feast, Prince Jabari stood, watching everything with pride in his eyes. He had always known Nyala was special, but tonight, he saw it clearer than ever. She was not just wise, she was a leader, a woman whose heart was strong enough to forgive, but whose mind was sharp enough to ensure justice. He stepped forward, raising his cup high. "To Nyala, he declared, his deep voice cutting through the night. "The woman who has shown us the true meaning of strength and kindness." The villagers cheered, their voices ringing out in unity. Nyala looked around at the faces before her, the people who once cast her aside, now welcoming her back with open arms. She had returned, not as the weak girl they had once mocked, but as a woman who had reshaped the fate of Zambora, with nothing but her resilience and her heart. And for the first time in a long time, Nyala felt at peace. As the years passed, the name Nyala became more than just a memory. It became a legend whispered from one generation to the next. In the village of Zambora, mothers told their daughters her story, elders spoke of her wisdom, and young girls looked up to her as a symbol of resilience and kindness. She was the girl who had once been cast aside, the one who returned not with vengeance, but with justice. She was the woman who forgave when others would have punished, the leader who showed mercy, but never allowed cruelty to reign again. Children sat around the fires at night, their eyes wide with wonder, as the elders told them about the day Nyala returned in grand attire, no longer a helpless girl, but a powerful force of change. They would listen, mesmerized, as the elders spoke of how she had given her oppressors a choice, not to suffer, but to redeem themselves, and that choice had shaped the future of Zambora forever. Muani, once feared and respected for all the wrong reasons, lived the rest of her days in service to the village. No longer did she walk with the air of a queen. Instead, she carried baskets for the elderly, swept the marketplace, and ensured that no girl in Zambora would ever face the same cruelty Nyala had endured. Her once proud shoulders slumped with age, but there was no bitterness left in her heart. She knew she had been given something rare, a second chance, a chance to right her wrongs before it was too late. And when the day finally came that she took her last breath, the villagers did not speak of her cruelty. They did not whisper about the woman who had once ruled with an iron fist. Instead, they remembered how she had changed, how she had worked to undo the damage she had caused. Muani was buried with honor, not for the power she once held, but for the humility she had embraced in the end. Fena, on the other hand, rose from the ashes of her past to become one of Zambora's most respected leaders. She had learned from Nyala that true strength was not in wealth or status, but in the way one treated others. And so, she dedicated her life to helping the weak, ensuring that no one in the village would suffer, as Nyala once had. She built schools, created safe spaces for young women, and made sure that kindness was the foundation of leadership. People who had once mocked her for being arrogant now looked up to her with admiration. She was living proof that change was possible, that even the worst mistakes could be turned into something good. And every time someone doubted the power of transformation, they only had to look at Fena to know it was real. As for Nyala, she did not seek power, nor did she rule as a queen. She lived simply, yet she remained the heart of Zambora, the woman whose wisdom was sought after by rulers from far and wide. People traveled great distances just to hear her speak, to seek her guidance, to learn from the woman who had turned pain into power, suffering into strength. And though years passed, her legacy never faded. Even long after she was gone, her story lived on in the hearts of the people. The village of Zambora thrived, not because of wealth, but because of... If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder that kindness and resilience always triumph over cruelty. Nyala's journey was not just about overcoming pain. It was about proving that true strength lies in forgiveness, in rising above the darkness, and in turning suffering into a lesson for others. How many Nyalas exist in the world today? How many people are silently enduring pain, waiting for their moment to rise? If this story moved you, share it with others. Let it inspire someone who needs hope. Let it remind the world that no matter how deep the scars, healing is possible. And if you believe in the power of justice, in second chances, and in the victory of good over evil, show your support. Like this video, share it with your loved ones, and subscribe to the channel so that more powerful stories like this can reach those who need them most. Together, let's spread messages of hope, resilience, and redemption. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your support means everything.